And hundreds of Trump supporters rallied at Beverly Gardens Park this afternoon, lining Santa Monica Boulevard, waving American flags and Trump flags. The Walkway campaign hosted the Rescue America rally. Their platform, they say, is about taking America back from the radical left.
And because of the progressive policies of the left, we can't go to church, but we can go protest against the police whose very lives are on the line protecting ours.
Donald Trump has got to go. Hey, hey, ho, ho. Donald Trump has got to go. Hey, hey, ho, ho. Donald Trump has got to go.
Because people on both sides of the aisle are absolutely fed up with the swampy behavior of Washington, with the crony corruption capitalism that's going on. And Joe Biden is no different.
Which is all you ever hear about in this country, is our differences. It's all they ever talk about. Politicians and the media, always pushing the things that separate us, things that make us different. That's the way the ruling class operates in any society. They divide the rest of the people. They keep the lower and the middle classes fighting with each other so that they, the rich, can run off with all the fucking money.
The majority of voters, they are just living their lives. They're not like you and me. They're not hyper political. They're not paying attention at every turn. They're living their lives. They turn on the news. They're exhausted by the news. The news is just bad news all the time. And they're stressed out and they just don't want to deal with it. And all they're hearing from the news, if they're turning on CNN or MSNBC, or if they're turning on Fox, depending on which narrative they're hearing, is that one side is awful and we've got to defeat that side. That's what they're hearing.
Anything that's different about us, you know that's what they're pushing at you. Racial differences, religious, ethnic, national backgrounds, jobs, income, education, social status, sexuality, anything they can do to keep us fighting with each other so that they can keep going to the bank. You know how I describe the economic and social classes in this country? The upper class keeps all of the money, pays none of the taxes. The middle class pays all of the taxes, does all of the work. The poor are there just to scare the shit out of the middle class. Keep them showing up at those jobs.
And so the average voter is not realizing that both sides are just two sides of the same, that it is really just one party. And the only difference is one claims to not be racist. But when it comes to economic policies, when it comes to foreign policy, both parties are pretty much the same.
But I'm not a really good American because I like to form my own opinions. I don't just roll over when I'm told to. Sad to say, most Americans just roll over on command. Not me. Not me. I have certain rules I live by. My first rule, I don't believe anything the government tells me. Nothing. Zero. And I don't take very seriously the media or the press in this country.
So actually, if you believe what's being told to you, and I just don't know why anyone would believe anything that comes out of the mouth of virtually any Western leader, whether it be Obama or Bush or any of the rest of them, all of these people are nothing but patent liars, and everything they say is pretty much the opposite of the truth.
And those economic policies and those foreign policies are what are ruining our lives. They're stealing our homes, they're raiding our bank accounts, and they're taking our children and sending them off to war to die. That is what they are doing to the middle class and to the poor. And yet, everybody on both sides buys into the boogeyman narrative and says, oh, but we've got to defeat the monster sitting on the other side. And for the left, it's the orange monster. And on the right, it is AOC and Nancy Pelosi. They're looking at them, you know, and look, both sides have their faults. Both sides are definitely feed into this. But at the end of the day, the real enemy is the crony capitalism and the War Department of our government. That is our real enemy. People have to wake up to this.
The beast of the national security state, the beast of endless wars, the beast of the alligator that came out of the swamp, for example, and bit Donald Trump just a few days ago, is alive and well America exists today to make war. How else do we interpret 19 straight years of war and no end in sight? It's part of who we are. It's part of what the American empire is. We are going to lie, cheat, and steal, as Pompeo is doing right now, as Trump is doing right now, as Esper is doing right now, as Lindsey Graham is doing right now, as Tom Cotton is doing right now, and a host of other members of my political party, the Republicans, are doing right now. We're going to cheat and steal to do whatever it is we have to do to continue this war complex. That's the truth of it, and that's the agony of it.
Do those people like that three-star general, does it ever dawn on them that they are a cog in an evil wheel?
It doesn't seem to. I just wrote an article recently about Smedley Butler, and I wrote, "Where have you gone, Smedley Butler?" You know, on like the Mrs. Robinson, you know, "Where have you gone, Joe DiMaggio?" And this guy was a Marine Corps two-star general, and he leaves in 1931, and for 10 years he speaks out against imperialism, and he goes all around the country, works himself to death. We haven't had a single general officer, not one, since 9/11, come out, go public against, full-throated against the wars.
To worry about Iraq, not Iran. I knew why, because I'd been through the Pentagon right after 9/11. We've made the decision we're going to war with Iraq. This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, we're going to war with Iraq. Why? He said, I don't know. He said, I guess they don't know what else to do. So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, are we still going to war with Iraq? And he said, oh, it's worse than that. He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, this is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran.
So General Wesley Clark famously said on Democracy Now! That he went in to the Pentagon after 9/11, and he was informed that they had a plan to invade 7 countries, and it was Syria, Afghanistan, and Libya, and so it's all the countries we're going into. And are the people in the military aware that he said that on videotape? And if they are, how did they then justify what they're doing?
I would say less than 5% even know that. There are some really great guys in the military. I mean, they're not all evil folks.
Right.
I mean, there are some smart guys, there are some pretty well-read guys, but there is an anti-intellectual culture that has pervaded the U.S. military forever, but it's gotten really strong. I think Wesley Clark's coming public about that was interesting, because I think we've invaded 4 out of 7 of those countries and bombed maybe more. So I think we're doing pretty good on the checklist. The military is really efficient at checklists. So we don't win anything, but we're good at doing lots, just not doing well.
So Al-Qaeda has grown stronger in Syria. Why have our U.S. policies not gone after Al-Qaeda in Syria?
Well, our policy is in Syria, which is a very complex battle space.
Are you amazed at how much the military-industrial complex controls the narrative through the corporate media, and people don't realize it?
100%. I mean, you cannot understand these wars and why they continue, whether you have an Obama who is a polite emperor, or Trump who's a coarse emperor, or Bush who's a buffoonish emperor, right? Pick your poison. You're going to get an emperor, but how do you like him? I think the reason that you see such continuity between these organizations is this military-industrial complex.
I joined the military to protect my family from terrorists. Not to become one. No to Syria.
And we reiterated our position that it is that we will support the Syrian people and that we will support a political process that results in him leaving, or we will continue to support the Syrian opposition in order to remove him by force. But as I said earlier, he will be removed.
I am confident that Assad's days are numbered.
The world will not waver. Assad must go.
We both agree that Assad needs to go.
It is just further evidence that Assad has to go.
He is no longer legitimate and that he needs to go.
For the sake of the Syrian people, the time has come for him to step aside.
For 50 years plus, we were fighting this Cold War that really was an absolute charade to begin with. There never really was a threat of a Soviet invasion. And for decades, we spent insane amounts of money developing nuclear weapons to the point of really completely, totally collective insanity.
Almost every country has a more modest foreign policy agenda. And I'm going to be careful at what I say, but even some countries that we label as enemies, while imperfect, have a better posture, a more modest posture with military. One stat that just says it all. We have 800 bases in 80 countries that we know about.
Right.
Combined, this is true, combined, all the other militaries in the world have between 30 and 40, depending on how you count, and that's a high estimate, overseas bases. Right? China has one, they're building their second. One, and they're building their second.
So we're seeing this letter asking the Pentagon to be more transparent about its U.S. overseas bases. Why did you choose to sign that letter?
Well, I'm a U.S. Army colonel. I spent 29 years in the U.S. military, and I think it's very important that American citizens know how many bases we have, where they are, and how much it costs to run them. Most Americans don't realize we have over 800 bases now, and that we have new bases that are being established, particularly in Africa.
Do you think that this is a problem that's specific to the U.S.? Do you think other countries are more transparent about the amount of bases they have?
Well, very few countries have bases outside their own countries. I mean, the UK has some, the French have some, Russia has a few, not many. China has a few, not many. But it's primarily the United States overwhelmingly has the overseas bases or bases in other people's countries.
I think is the actual amount of money that is used from U.S. taxpayers.
Well, we think it may be double that, up to $15 billion that are being spent by the U.S. government to house, equip, train, have military operations for men and women in our military, and also Department of Defense civilians that are assigned to these bases.
Trump is now claiming that the U.S. is closer than ever to ending the Iraq War. And while some claim that this is just part of his much bigger plan to end the endless wars like he promised,
At the same time, we will pursue a new foreign policy that finally learns from the mistakes of the past. We will stop looking to topple regimes and overthrow governments, folks. Pursue a new era of peace, understanding, and goodwill.
others note that the next presidential election is right around the corner, and this type of rhetoric is not exactly rare. In fact, if you look back at the election of 2000, you see this candidate named George W. Bush, who campaigned against a foreign policy of nation building. Fast forward a few years after his administration had invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, and then he gave his legendary Mission Accomplished speech, in which he claimed that all of the combat missions in Iraq were done and won, except that they weren't, and that made room for another candidate named Barack Obama to come along in 2008 and to campaign for ending the wars in the Middle East altogether. Except then his administration discovered this thing called a drone and went on to illegally bomb 7 countries, and that made room for another candidate named Donald Trump to come along in 2016 with the catchy slogan of ending the endless wars altogether, for real this time. And yet, even though we look back and we see all of the empty election promises from both parties, and yet all the while there were 535 members of Congress just sitting there, knowing that they never voted for these wars, making them illegal under U.S. law.
That we're going to still have CIA folks, CIA-backed militias, read warlords, child-raping warlords, real talk, and also special forces and probably bombings. So it's still going to look a lot like a war.
And yet every single year they manage to come together to come up with hundreds of billions of dollars in funding to make sure that those wars continued all around the world. And yet it's not like the American people want this. I mean, the majority of Americans would much rather that money, their hard-earned tax dollars, be spent at home in their communities and for their families than to be used to bomb countries around the world and to kill innocent civilians in massive numbers. And yet the members of Congress continue to represent their corporate interests, their lobbyists.
I have very little faith in the sincerity of the U.S. government, whether it's Trump or Obama. The real powers behind that, the national security state, the militarist state, has no intention, I believe, in leaving Afghanistan. There's too many minerals under that soil. There's too much of a great game going on in Eurasia between Russia and China, all of which is false and over-exaggerated, but I think that we don't have any real intention of leaving.
Instead of the American people. So no matter who is in power, no matter who wins the 2020 election, it is about time that we start calling for some real accountability for those members of Congress who have been there all along and yet have failed time and time again to actually represent the people that they were elected to serve. And that's something everyone should be talking about.
My guest today is retired Army Major turned war critic Danny Shurgin, and he joins me now to talk about his experience in Afghanistan and the lessons he's learned from America's endless wars. Hi, nice to meet you.
Oh, nice to meet you, Jimmy. I'm glad to be here.
So now you served in Afghanistan, and I just want to know, what was it? When did you realize that these wars were built on lies?
You know, first it was Iraq. So I was in Iraq first. I was a full-throated believer, probably a burgeoning neocon, but didn't have the language to describe that. All in for Bush, all in for the freedom agenda. And then folks started getting killed, mostly locals. I mean, I was policing a civil war and getting attacked on both sides.
As soon as the first excuse came to mind. We've been supporting ISIS in Jordan, in Turkey, through our proxies in Saudi Arabia and Qatar. There is absolute continuity between the policies of Iraq and breaking it up and breaking up Syria as well. It is beyond naive to suggest that the U.S. doesn't have its fingerprints all over ISIS. In fact, tell me this, why has ISIS never once, or al-Nusra Front or al-Qaeda, not once have they attacked Israel? In fact, ISIS militants are getting medical attention in the Golan Heights and in Israel itself. What does that tell you? There is absolute continuity, but the actual policy, just like the Project for a New American Century laid out very clearly, that a, quote, new Pearl Harbor would be necessary to achieve this goal of full spectrum dominance, you could never tell the American people, or the world for that matter, we're going to fight wars of aggression where we're going to have to invade and occupy, we're going to have to spend hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars to achieve the goal of full spectrum dominance, which is to control, absolute control over air, land, sea, and space and cyberspace. The American people never would have bought it, so you can't tell them that. You have to tell them a bunch of lies.
But we're supposed to believe that Russia is going to come through Eurasia, and then they're going to end up at your kid's school, and China's going to come across the Taiwan Strait and end up here in LA. But, you know, of course, the reality of that, while there are issues with any of these countries that are powerful and have nuclear weapons, they're not perfect, but it's the United States that's off the rails. I'm sorry. My country, the country that I fought for and, you know, took the oath to, is off the rails in an historic sense.
As an American, I honor thy founding fathers, beginning with George Washington at his farewell address, no foreign entanglements. And then you listen to Franklin and Adams and Jefferson and Madison, no foreign entanglements.
And then we join the military, and they tell us that our enemies are poor people in caves in Afghanistan, or poor people in the deserts of Iraq. But we've been to those countries, and we know that our enemies are not other poor people abroad. Our enemies are the people that laid us off from our jobs, that denied us health care, that make it impossible to get an education. Our enemies are not in the poorest countries on the planet, but right here in the richest one. The occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan alone are costing over $700 million every single day. This is a crime. Every single day, while so many of us are hurting. Well, I think all of us here, and the vast majority of people in this country, would agree that we can spend $700 million a day better than bombing people that we have no reason to bomb.